things. And I'll mute you if you are muted. So just to get started, as we're in this first couple minutes, feel free to put in chat what your name is and where you are calling in from.
Oops.
Love seeing the world cross section.
We feel that the mirror is for anybody, for adults also, involving the family unit, involving the support unit.
Okay. Great. And I've gone ahead and muted everyone just in case. So if you need to unmute yourself at some point, that's fine. Cool, we've got a great cross section everywhere from Toronto, Boston, Washington, India, Sandpoint. Great. Cool, so we're gonna get started. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah, and I'm doing this. And also hope that this isn't freezing. Okay, there we go. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, just in case. Okay, good. So I'm Sarah, and I've been hosting these webinars just to explore different topics. I teach communication and connection, mostly through training facilitators and leadership, and also through different life leadership programs and explorations in the United States and all over the world. And these webinars have been my chance to play with some of the topics that I discover through those explorations and hopefully engage y'all in it. And it's also a bit of a teaser for a course that I do called the Authentic Life course. So the topic that I wanted to play with today is status and power. And this one is a little bit edgier for me than I usually do, because a lot of the time when I do topics, they're things that I've explored pretty deeply and like researched a lot and feel like I have a good sense of. And status and power, like I haven't actually done as much in-depth research into it. It's just something that I see coming up again and again as one of the main influences on groups. Ones I participate in my family, in my work, in, you know, anywhere out in the world. Power, this unseen dynamic that permeates our lives and that we don't usually consider as something that we could have control over. So some of this call will be me talking, and some of it will be considerations, things to put in chat, things to just contemplate for yourself. Sometimes we even get to do breakout rooms, although it's a little hard with this many people, so we'll see. And I'm gonna give an example of of status and how that's shown up in my life at one point recently that had me curious, which is so back in November, I went to my family gathering. My whole extended family gathers at Thanksgiving. It's the one time of the year and we all see each other. And there's kind of like, my family is like fairly stratified. Like there's my grandmother, who's the matriarch, there's her kids, and then there's their kids. So there's three of us kids. There's three of like our parent siblings and their significant others, and then there's my grandma. And there's two very different sides of other. My side of the family is more into revealing and kind of discussing different dynamics and opening up and processing and all of that. We're kind of the black sheep. We're a little bit more hippie. And then the other side of the family is more traditional. Like the table always gets set the same way for Thanksgiving. And then for like a Hanukkah dinner the next night, there's always the same food cooked. We do the Jewish thing of talking about where we've like been able to get discounts on things, or at least that side of the family does. Um, and one of the things that's come up is like the family really wanting to talk more honestly with each other. And so, and I've, been learning authentic relating for a while and practicing it. And that's had an impact on my family. My family knows I do it. And so when I got to Thanksgiving this year, I found myself in this really interesting place, which is I'm a grandkid. I'm the lowest on the totem pole in terms of status. And I can feel this desire in my family for something, at least in previous years, I like felt this big expectation on myself. Like I need to be able to just say something. Like how do I, how do I show up in my family? Why is it that I can't be self-expressed in the way that I am, in my groups and everywhere else in the world? Oh, it sounds like I'm cutting in and out. How's the internet connection? So, give me just a second. Let me attempt to remedy that. Did you all get the gist of the story, or should I repeat it? You got the gist. Okay, 1 second. Okay, that'll work better. Okay. So in previous years, I wasn't able to figure out how to bring myself forward, and that's the interesting thing about status and power is that I don't have status in a certain situation. I don't know how to show up as my full self in it. Has anyone had that experience? Like you're like, why am I not able to like bring myself? This is really confusing. Yeah. And so I would just get in these self-judgment cycles of like, what is going on? How come I can't be myself here, be the person I know I can be? And as I've been, playing more and more with authentic relating, as I was writing this authentic life course the last year and having to actually figure out how would I do authentic relating practices in real life, I started getting back a little bit more of how to gain that status and power and agency, which is one thing I want to talk about here, even when the environment doesn't support it. So I'm at Thanksgiving this year, and I need to figure out, like, how do I show up? And I experimented a little bit. Like I offered a question at the dinner table at Thanksgiving rather than the conversation just doing its usual, like everybody kind of having somewhat awkward conversations about what they do. I asked, like, what was the kind of most exciting and the most difficult thing that happened for you this year? And people answered it and they kept the conversation going. And then the next day I was sitting with my grandma and my mom at the dinner table and I introduced an improv game. And the reaction that it had in my family was, my uncle took me aside and was like, this is awesome. Like, thank you for doing this. I'm glad we're having these conversations. It seemed to spark some other stuff. And my brother took me aside and went, what the hell? Like, why can't you just like be normal and have a normal conversation? And like, why do you have to make everything awkward? I love him dearly. And it was this real moment of like, so here's the power in my family. And if I do something to step outside of my role in that hierarchy, it's going to have an effect. Some people are going to like it. Some people are going to dislike it. The very fact of me taking on a new role is going to have an effect. It's much easier when I travel and I'm like already known as the leader than when I go into a new community that doesn't know me and I have to win over everybody. So I've been just thinking a lot about like, what is it that we do when we don't have status in a group? And is it even a good idea sometimes to take that status? Because it is going to change things. And then there's also the question of each of us. So one thing I talk about is like, there's in my world 3 types of context. context is like the frame on reality. It's the glasses that we see the world through. And there's personal context, which is our beliefs, our upbringing, our internal systems, the things about ourselves. And that can include how much power we believe that we have, or how much status. So just consider for a moment, in this group, like just looking around, just having walked in, how much status would you automatically assume that you have? Medium, not sure. 6. Nice. I imagine that each of us walking into a group, or walking into a group of some sort, assumes that we have a certain amount of status. Yes, 0. And that's partly what we carry within us, like how we think we measure up to other people in the world. And that's probably different depending on the type of the group. I'm using, thanks for the question, Josh, I'm using power. The definition I came up with is the capacity that you have to influence a group or a situation. And status is the power you have relative to other people. So basically, like, and that's just the social definition I'm using. So if I have power in this group, or if I'm using power, I'm changing the way things are, right? Like right now I could say, okay, we're all going to play a game. And I have like the power to do that. Anybody in this group could say, hey, let's play a game. You have power to do that. However, if you don't have status in the group, other people may not listen. So I could say, let's play a game, and people would probably say yes, but someone else on this call, I think, might have a harder time doing it. And this is just the way that I'm defining it for now. So feel free to post in chat if you have other thoughts or definitions. So there's like the status that we assume that we have in different groups. There's the status that we think we have relative to other people. So there's social context. Like in groups, a lot of the time there's like a certain amount of figuring out like who has the power here. Like when you walk into a group for the first time, if you walk into a party, it's like, okay, who's the host? Who knows who? Like who seems to be the center of different groups? If I feel kind of like a little lower status, maybe I'm going to go talk to the person on the outside of the group. If I'm feeling confident and like I belong here, maybe I'm going to go straight into the group with like a bunch of people I know. And then there's like environmental context, which is what I'm wearing, like what's happening in my environment. That influences my status and power as well. Matthew, so you're defining power as the ability to act, and status as the assumption of others listening. At a basic level, I might say yes. That could be one definition of it. Yeah, I think you, yeah. And then there's like the belief of how much power you have, for instance. Like you might not be able to influence other people to act, but you can have the power to speak to something anyways. There's like internal, like the power I have over myself and the power I have over other people. But status, I think, is more relative. Like status is usually in relation to others. Okay, so all that being said, I'd love it just to take a moment and think about a situation recently where you felt like you didn't know how to influence something that you wanted to. And consider, and maybe post in chat, what status or power did you feel you had in that group? Like who had the power? Where was the power in the group relative to you? And what impact did that have on your ability to speak up? And maybe also consider, in that group, did you feel like power was being used well, as you would define well? Maybe let's see if one person wants to share. Circling lab on Monday is confusing where the power and status is. Yeah. Lorelei says, my ability to influence is so impacted in my belief, by my belief and my ability to influence. Totally. Meetings at work. I had a really interesting facilitation training call the other day where we workshopped a situation that was difficult for one of the participants. And the situation she came up with is she was facilitating a group, and the group had a manager who she was supposed to be facilitating with the rest of the group, but the manager tried to take back over control. And then it was like this weird situation where it's like, well, if you speak up against the manager, then you're disempowering part of the group, but you can't let the manager take over because then you're disempowered as the facilitator. So situations like that get really interesting. Great. A group task in school, we had to build something in teams. Power seemed to be taken by the people who just jumped in and started doing things versus the quietness of actually thinking out the design and building process. And it's very difficult to redirect things once people started. So that's a really cool thing. One of the things I wanted to touch on in this call is that power, when power is unclear, power can get taken by the person that speaks first or speaks most, unless what they're saying is like really stupid. And I'm using stupid as like an amusing term, but like, unless what they're saying is something that's like enough against the social context that people like end up not wanting to listen. It's actually why Priya Parker, who wrote The Art of Gathering, has this wonderful section in there where she talks about the benefit of taking leadership in a group, the benefit of, if you're hosting an event, being intentional about how you set it up, like taking the time to step in at the beginning and give an intro, even if you're breaking the flow, or asking people to bring a certain thing or whatever. That as hosts, sometimes we feel like, oh, I'm intruding on people. Like, you know, I shouldn't ask that. I should just let people have their experience. Well, letting people have their experience often creates a power vacuum that the loudest voice steps into. So it can be really of service to use your status as host of a group in order to create the sort of situation that you want. One of also the roughest things is when a group has a leader that doesn't want to take power, and so you can't tell where the power is. I actually find Circling Lab, which somebody mentioned, sometimes a little bit like that, where oftentimes like people get in the room and everyone just sits quietly. And if the leaders don't feel called to speak, they don't. And then people are like, how do I, like, where is my role in this group? How do I be a human without knowing who I'm going to offend? Like, what do I do? Yeah. I love the comments that are coming in chat here. The quietest people can have all the power. No one is with all the power until the others give up.
No, the no has all the power.
Ah, I see. Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you. There's a great system called Holacracy, which is a system of management. I'm seeing some nods from those who might understand it. We use that in my company now. And the thing that Holacracy does is it assumes, there's a phrase I thought of the other day, which is you can't remove power from a system, you can only distribute it. And Holacracy says, like, okay, there's gonna automatically be power in a system. Like I've worked with management teams where the managers really want to be like inclusive, and so they're like trying to include everyone in decisions and give up power, and then their employees keep calling them and asking them like, what do I do? And they're like, but we you know, we gave away power. And they didn't really give it away. They delegated it. They didn't abdicate it. They said, hey, I want to hear your opinion, which isn't the same as you have the power to make the decision, you know, ask me for help if you need it, but this is yours. And so Holacracy basically says, okay, we're going to define everyone's role and exactly what they're expected to do in that role. And then the only thing that we do in meetings is figure out whose role it is to do different things. And then they're automatically expected to do it. And it's a really fascinating way of running a company without the need for managers, because everyone knows what's within their power to do, or there's a process for figuring it out. The other question I wanted to ask, just to consider for a minute, is when you don't feel like you know what did I want to ask in this? When you don't feel like you have status in a group, what's your response? When you walk into a work meeting, or you walk into a party, or you're in a situation where all of a sudden somebody takes the power, what do you do?
Quiet.
Saying observe, not contribute much. Stay quiet. I'm seeing a lot of quiet.
Is this where you just don't have power, or where you've lost power because someone took over? Like that?
It could be either way, actually. For me, those are definitely two different reactions.
Yeah.
I'm not going to super define it for now, so feel free to give the distinction if that occurs to you. Analyze the situation, try to figure out how to get power or influence, say something to see what happens, get quiet, or figure out how to gain influence. Yeah. And it depends probably on the role that you're playing in the group too, right? Like if you are feeling like there's something you need to impact, like you need to get something across, you're probably going to try harder to gain status. Hide or blend in. Stay quiet. There was a experience that I had when I was working with a staff team for one of my trainings, where I noticed that everyone in the room was just like a little quiet, like, and people weren't physically touching too much, and they just seemed kind of uncomfortable with each other. Like a lot of what you're talking about, if people seem to be staying quiet and analyzing a lot. And I was like, what is happening in this group that this is occurring? And some people in the group knew each other, some didn't. We were about to they were about to staff a training for a weekend. And I said, how many people feel like you're an outsider to this group? And almost everybody raises their hands, including people who have been in the community for years, by the way. And I said, like, what would happen if you just automatically assumed that you belong in this group? Because I think belonging is actually a form of status. And it's like, because when we don't feel like we belong, we're not on the inside, so we don't invite anyone else on the inside either. We stay on the outside and we wait for someone else to invite us in. But if nobody feels like they're on the inside, nobody invites us in. And you don't know who has the status or power in the group. And so you get this situation that's kind of unfortunate, where you have a lot of people who could really contribute to each other, but they're all waiting to see if they're included. So I said, like, let's assume this weekend that you belong and just see what happens. And it was the best staff team we'd ever had. Like one of our staff, the volunteer coordinator, wrote that it felt like a group Ouija board. Like everyone had their hand on the group pulse and was just automatically picking up from each other every moment. Yeah. So something I want to talk a little bit about, get a little bit into the meat of like what some of my thoughts on like when you don't have status in a group, what are some of the things that you can do? And I'm gonna like give some ideas, and then I'm just gonna kind of open it up for questions and discussion. Since I didn't have as clear of an idea of this, I definitely want it to be collaborative. So one of the things, so at a very basic level, what status looks like. Body posture. So sitting with a relatively open body posture, clarity of speech, tone of speech, something in groups when you're facilitating in order to change your status, basically. Like if I'm going from playing a game as a participant to being the facilitator, I tend to stand up. So I change my position in the room. I raise my voice, so there's a change in my vocal tone, and I try to enunciate a little bit more. So that helps with status and change. And if you want to go lower status to someone, which can actually be helpful in some places, like if someone is seeing you as a threat, it can help to actually go lower status to them so they don't feel threatened. Like if someone's like kind of starting to attack you, you can literally like sit on the ground in front of them, and it defuses the situation a lot. Not with everyone, but I've done that sometimes. So making eye contact is also a sign of status. And then how much you blend in to a group. Like, do you wear clothes and have body mannerisms that are considered high status to the group? And that changes group to group. So if I'm going into a new group, I actually have to observe them for a while. I have to see like what is considered acceptable to this group, what is status. And something I learned that was really interesting is a lot of the time going equal status to someone is actually a much better way, is the best way to make friends with them or make them like you. Like they studied people doing job interviews, and they found that the best way to get the job interview was to go equal status to the person. So it can really help to observe situations before you engage. Like some of you were saying, analyze. I think that's actually a brilliant tactic, because you don't know what mannerisms you need to imitate until you've actually gone into the group. Yeah. Okay. So aside from just physical features of status, which can be high or low or equal depending on how you want to do it, what do you do when status in a group is either unclear or someone else takes it, or it's like it's not being managed in a way that's good? Let's just hear some ideas first. Like what would you do to clarify or like retake or assert status in a graceful way? And just put some ideas in chat. Gain consensus or agreements. I assume that's maybe make agreements. Yeah, so you could actually change the social context so that everyone knows where the status and power are. That's great. What else? Notice who's not being considered or included and reach out to include them. Yeah, oftentimes including others like is a form of status. Helping is a form of status. Asking to pause or revisit our objectives. So connecting to a wider context that we're all aligned on. I think a lot of the time context itself has high status in a group. Make meta context statements. Like it seems like, there's a phrase I love, which is we seem. Like we seem lost. Can we revisit our objectives for this meeting? Like that's a way to make clarity again. Great, and Laura said that all these options can create distance as well. This is where it gets really complicated, right? Like anytime you're changing the frame of a group, you're going to run into resistance, because groups are like, people are like a train that's running on a track. And as soon as you put a roadblock, when it derails, there's this second of like, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. And then like, then there's a new track and people are like, okay, we can do this track, but you have to a lot of the time get past the fire of the oh shit moment. Prompt the person that is supposed to be in charge to be in charge. So that's a great one. If somebody drops the leadership, like if there's a leader, this happens often when a leader gets challenged, or like say you're even in connection with like a partner and you say something that is like they don't know how to deal with. Like you're in a conversation and you're like, I feel like really depressed today. In that moment, the impetus is on them to respond, but they might not know how to. And so you get this moment of like, like you feel dropped, they feel confused. And for a second there, you don't know who has the power in the situation, like who's supposed to respond. And you can even resent the other person for not taking up their role when it feels like they're supposed to. It's why is a great response. Like if anybody says anything, just make sure you have some response. Even if it's just like a nod, it really relaxes people. Okay, so this is a good one. I don't know if it's graceful, but I often start implicitly coalition building, figuring out who else is feeling like power isn't being used well. So that's a tricky one, actually, because that coalition building can divide a group. You get, there starts feeling like a real us or them. People are very sensitive to any idea of being power under or socially rejected. And so if I'm going to do something like that, the most common way I do it is I like ask people for information, like who else is feeling this? And I might not say it, I might actually go to individuals to start with, but then I make sure that I bring it to the person involved or to the group before they hear from others that I'm talking about them. Because as soon as you hear that someone else has been talking about you behind your back, it's really difficult for a group to trust each other. And one more is, instead of pushing up against what appears to be ineffective, offer up an alternative in a way where people can see both and decide which is more effective or appealing to them. That's also, love these. Y'all are coming up with great ones. People respond better to specifics than they do to general. So if you're trying to like create something in a group and you're not sure like where the power is, but you want to kind of figure it out and get us back on track, and you say, okay, what do we want to do now? You've still created a power vacuum. Like still nobody knows like who's going to make the decision. But if you say like, I'd love to get us back on track. Do we want to continue this conversation, or does anyone have an idea for something else we could do? It's still a little bit ambiguous because we still don't know who's going to carry that idea forward. But if you start speaking to people's suggestions after they're giving them, then it's a lot clearer where the group can go. So I'll give a couple that I came up with. Finding a way to talk to the leader on a break. So rather than calling somebody out in front of the room, waiting for a pause and then going and talking to them and saying, hey, here's something that I see. Are you noticing this as well? And that often leads to the leader incorporating that suggestion when they come back to the group. I love it when people do this to me. I actually got a withhold yesterday that was pretty intense from a member of my community that apparently a couple years ago I'd made a comment that was pretty ageist, and I didn't even know it, and I didn't know it for years until he told me. And when I heard it, I wanted to just like completely contract and shrivel up inside and be like, I was ageist, let me just disappear forever. But in reality, what was happening is I was being given a really good point of information. Like, here's this perspective that you weren't aware of because you're not part of that subgroup. And thank God somebody told me. So if he'd called that out in front of the group, it might have been really hard for me to figure out how to respond because I might have frozen in that moment. And the group probably would have gotten really tense. Like, oh shit, is there like a status, a power struggle going on here? So I appreciated that he told me on a break. And if he told me on a break in the moment, then afterwards I could have addressed, done something to address it, said, apologized to the group, or created a situation where we all got to explore social and power dynamics together, which I often like doing. And in another group, one girl just started building a new design when her groups wasn't effective, and eventually people noticed and joined her. One of my absolute favorite things to do, and I always forget it, is just start acting in the way that you want other people to act. And they magically start doing it. A friend of mine went to a Tantra course, and he noticed that, and so in the course, one of the last activities they did was everybody walked down a line of people, and people were allowed to touch them anywhere that they had exposed skin. So anywhere that they had covered by clothes, you didn't touch. And my friend noticed after a little while that people were starting to break the rules. They were starting to just kind of touch indiscriminately. So it got to be my friend's turn, and he didn't want to be touched in places that were covered by clothes. And so he made a big deal of tucking in his shirt and rolling up his sleeves and showing exactly where he could be touched and not. And so he starts going down the line with his eyes closed. And for a while, people are respectful, and then they start touching places that he doesn't want. And so he stops, he opens his eyes, he makes a big show of like changing his clothing again, tucking his clothing back in, and he goes down the line again, and he doesn't get touched anywhere he doesn't want to. And then everyone that goes after him doesn't get touched where they don't want to. So he basically, rather than calling the leader out, rather than changing anything, he just demonstrated the behavior that he wanted very explicitly and reminded people of the context by doing it. You can get a lot of power and a lot of like real beauty as a participant of a group by doing the actions that you want to see in others. And if you want, if it's at the point where you're like, actually, this is something that I'm really not comfortable with, and if you want to come in and say something, in order to preserve the power structure, it can help to ask. To say like, hey, is it okay if I mention something here? And especially to say, you can, if to make it stronger, you can say what it's in service of. Like, can I mention something here? I just want to clarify a point that people may not have understood. And then wait to see if the leader says yes. As I've been teaching other leaders to lead my facilitation trainings because I want them to live on without me, and I want to have multiple leaders represented in them. And I've really discovered that I'm a strong personality in the room, and I automatically have status because people know me and know that I created this stuff. And so I have to be very intentional to not do anything that would take away power from the leads, because if I do, they're not able to have as much influence or effect on a group. It's really important for us to know where power is. So if you take it from someone else, sometimes you're actually doing a disservice to the group, because then people don't know who to look towards in order to actually have an experience, or to feel safe. And so if I'm going to step in and offer a correction, even if I'm like, they just said that teaching completely wrong, I'm not going to say, hey, I just want to offer a correction here. You know, this is the way it's actually supposed to be said. I always ask first, hey, is it okay if I add something? And that makes it clear that the ball is still in their court, the power is still theirs. And sometimes they don't let me, which is great. I'm like, great, I get to hold on to my feelings of that the group is going to be totally misserved and that everything is going to suck forever, which is not usually the case. Cool. Alana, I love your question, and it feels like a discussion. So I'm gonna take a look just a sec to see if I'm missing anything. Just the less graceful ways of doing this is if someone is talking, just interrupt them in the middle of what they're saying. Which, you know, sometimes you have to do if someone's talking for a very long time and they're taking up power through speech. You might say, can I pause you for just a minute? Wait for a second, and then say something that ideally validates their perspective or validates them, but also changes the frame. A great way to do that might be to say something like, can I pause you for a second? I'm loving what you're saying, and I think you're raising an interesting topic. I'd love to hear what other people think of it. So then you basically just said, you know, great, what you're saying is cool. Let's distribute it to the group. And another less graceful way of doing things is to directly challenge the leader, which, like I said, creates often a division in the group, where people feel like they have to take a side. One of the coolest ways I saw this dealt with was a couple years ago in a workshop that I was in. There was a power struggle going on between the leaders, an obvious one. And they addressed it by having a mediated conversation where everyone who was on the side of, it was a man and the woman, everyone who was on the man's side went behind him, and everyone that was on the woman's side went behind her, and they just had a mediated conversation with like their constituents behind them. But sometimes if one of them made a particularly compelling argument, people would come and like go behind that person, and you had this like dynamic like status power thing that it made explicit what was happening in the room. Sometimes somebody said this earlier, but just speaking to what's occurring is really powerful. Like, wow, it seems like we don't know who has the power in this room. Anyone else feel that? Yeah. Okay, great. I want to read Alon's question. As a Socratic facilitator, a struggle I'm having with this framing is that yes, I want just enough power and status to hold the container, but the other side of this that doesn't feel acknowledged is the cultural issue of pre-existing power, status, and dominance, and my desire to support those that don't have inherent power. Yeah, that is a beautiful point. I see this coming up a lot in gender dynamics. Like women sometimes are less likely to speak out in groups, or in the dynamic of people who tend to be quieter and like tend to have a longer processing time. They're much more rarely the people to speak up first. And yeah, there are a lot of different ways to address that. I'm just going to name a few that I've tried. One is to speak to it. Like, hey, I'm noticing the women in the group haven't spoken up as much. I'd love to leave space for the next share to be from a woman. Another might be to have a group discussion about the fact that this is happening and ask, okay, group that's not speaking as much, like what would help you feel empowered to speak up? And a caveat I want to say here, by the way, is like, there's a thing happening in our culture where I think everybody to some extent feels disempowered or even like is enjoying feeling like they're the underdog. And it creates anything that creates divisions in groups, I think is actually harmful to groups. So like anything that has people feel like they're against each other or have to defend against each other. So if you come out by saying the men are speaking a lot, the women should have a chance to speak, that may make the men feel like they're doing something wrong and all of a sudden they need to defend or they get into shame. And so really, as you're in social situations, as you're in groups, I'm using more group leadership examples because that's what I'm more familiar with, but even in a social group, it just try to frame things in a way where you're welcoming and acknowledging both sides or trying not to make them wrong as much as possible. Or leaving space for people to speak to any impact on their experience. One other thing that I'll do sometimes when the dynamic is really overt is this is just like this is just an example of how you can gamify things. You wouldn't do this in a social situation, but something I did in a facilitation once. I had a group where it was a facilitation training. There were, I think, 20 women and 1 man. Just happened like that. We had a gender balanced facilitation team, and it was affecting people. Like you could see it, you can feel it. Like people didn't. There was a certain like I don't know when to speak up, or like just an implicit dynamic happening there. And so on the second day, realizing that this was affecting the group, I said, okay, we're going to play a game where like somebody can speak a context you're aware of, and people can move closer or further away from that person to the extent that they're aware of and affected by that context, that it's influencing their experience. So like age is a context, how much you're affected by just your awareness of age in the group. The fact that there's only 1 man, political belief maybe seeming different from other people. And we got to see this spectrum of like what people were aware of and affected by, and giving people a chance to share, like, what is it like to be aware of that? And what is it like to not be aware of that? So there's one of the difficult things in playing with this kind of like, how do you empower people, or is that not everyone realizes that others may need some help to express themselves more. In social groups, a way that I like dealing with that often is finding the person that seems to be a little bit on the outside and just talking with them, like making some sort of contact. That can even be just saying hello to someone or smiling at someone has a huge impact for someone feeling like they have a place in the group. So one-to-one contact is pretty powerful there. Okay. And one last thing I want to say on all this is, in places where situations, for instance, where the power dynamic switches around, like say you have a company and you have employees, but they're also friends. This is true in my company. Hi, Jennifer. Uh, there's moments like, and this is less true now that my company runs on Holacracy, because there's less like, okay, I need you to do this. But there were moments in the past where I had to figure out, like, how do I ask someone to do their job from a position of power without screwing up the friendship? Because I still want to have a power equal position most of the time. Like, and I would get very stuck, and I would hold off on these conversations for days or weeks. Anyone ever had that experience? Like not knowing how to navigate having to like change power with someone, or even if you're breaking up with someone, that's actually having to take the upper hand in terms of power and influence the situation. Or with a roommate, I'm seeing that, or subtenant. One way to deal with that situation can be to say, you know, okay, for this moment, I'm going to put on the manager hat, and I'm going to play this role that we're in together. Can we be on the same page about that? Are you okay with that? And maybe I do that in asking the other person, or maybe I just do it inside myself. And then I might say like, okay, I'm going to take it off, and like, how are we doing just on a personal level? So you can kind of just speak to the clarity of what status you're in. Okay, so I wanna say something quick about the course that a lot of this is coming from, because that's one of the intentions of the webinars, is number one, for me for just like to get a chance to have really interesting conversations or thinkings, but also because I've been trying to create a way of making this stuff more actionable in real life. It's hard to practice good connection and communication tools on our own, because when we go into a situation where the power dynamics are the same as they have been, like family, it's hard to speak up. You actually need a place to practice where you can have equal status to other people and play with, making requests, play with asking for feedback, play with changing situations, and know that you're not going to get a super strong reaction. You're actually going to get to practice. So this course is a way to do that. It's a 9-week online course where you get to practice with a triad of people that you get put into. So you'll get different exercises on, seeing contexts, feedback, making requests, changing situations, deepening conversations, having conversations with people that don't want you to be authentic with them, or don't, where you're not on the same page. How do you deal with that? And so it's all of this, and there's a bunch of exercises to practice it in a safe space, in small groups, to do Q&A calls. There's ones with me once a month and ones with a coach every week. And then also assignments to do out in your life and report back, like what happens when you start to try to change things. I really think it's a place where we need good support. So that's something that I've been trying to provide. I'll post a link in chat for coming on the call. I'll get I think it's $150 discount to the course. So usually it's $450 and it's $300 for the folks that came on this webinar, because you took the time already. And I want to let Jennifer say something if you want to, because she's coached the last cohort and she'll be doing the next one, which it starts on April 9th, I believe. And then we'll take some questions for the last 10 minutes. Jennifer, anything you want to say?
Well, what interests me is there's a few people who have been through the course on this call today too. And so I was curious to invite maybe Luke or someone else who's been through it who might have something to say. That seemed of value as well. But yeah, it's a great container. I love it. The information is fantastic because it's this chance to explicitly explore, and over time all these different relations and things that come up and crop up as you dive in and check it out. I definitely would suggest you see what you think, go look at it, and take this opportunity if you're interested to get a little bit of a reduction in the tuition and come join us. I love coaching it. I love the groups that come through, the people that come through, and what we get to find out and explore.
Luke or someone who's been through it, do you want to say something?
Well, I noticed that the moment that you said Luke has gone through the course, has been given status. And then all of a sudden this power, this thing that I am so adverse to, like, okay, I'm so attuned with, like, I have influence now about what I say about the course. So then all of a sudden I feel this pressure to say exactly the right thing, and I can't find my true words, right? And so the first thing that happened when Jennifer said, hey, Luke, I was like, what the fuck? Like, you didn't even ask me in silence. You could have been like, hey, Luke, do you want to chat? And like, I have a question. Do you want to? So then I'm like, all this pressure. I don't want to lose you guys as friends. I don't want to be seen as a wimp by not speaking up. So I figured I'll just talk about my experience, which I learned to do in the course. Thanks.
Oh my God, that was beautiful. Thank you for both revealing your experience, tying it into what we were talking about, and giving such a good example of like power and status and what happens with that in a group, even when you're named. And even that, like, for some people probably being named would be like, yes, I have power in this group, I've been like hiding this whole time. And for other people it's like, damn it, like now I have to figure out what to say and there's pressure. And for other people it's like, I always have, like, everyone's always calling me out as having power in groups. Like, I don't want to, we all have really different reactions to having or being given power, right? Awesome. Well, thank you for saying something. And I'm curious if anyone else has questions for our last 5 or so minutes together, or comments either about the course or about power and status or anything that you want to talk about. You can say them aloud or post them in chat as you desire.
I guess I have a question around, this is like too big of a question to ask for 5 minutes, but like one of the things I've been thinking about lately is when you do have power or status in a group or an organization, sometimes there's a question of, is that why people are drawn to me? Because they want access to what I have access to via me? And if so, what are the ways that that is similar to and different from being drawn to any other attribute of me that they might be drawn by? Like that, I could look at that as just, well, that's just part of my package and that's that, just like any other thing. Or I could look at that as, well, that's not really about me. That's about getting through me to something else. And I don't know, I'm just thinking, that's something I've been thinking about for several months now, but I'm not really getting anywhere with it.
Yeah, I deal with that one a lot too. It makes dating really hard. And I don't necessarily have a solution to it. I think I do a lot of just like checking it out. Like the share I most hear is like, I'm intimidated by you. And I don't think I'm naturally like a super intimidating person, but I do show up as high status a lot of the time, I think. And most of that's just because I lead groups so much that it's my normal way of being. And in groups, you have to be like pretty overt about status in order to show up as high status. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the time, like the way that I'll manage it is I'll equalize status by getting vulnerable. Mm-hmm. I'll share with them like what it's like for me to, I'll be like, wow, I'm super like, I love that you're being honest with me, that you're intimidated by me, but it's like really frustrating for me to get this share all the time. And I don't really know how to deal with it. And, you know, some people will be like, what did I do wrong? But continuing the conversation, it actually oftentimes humanizes me. Mm-hmm. So that's what I've been trying recently.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing it up. I feel care for you being in that situation.
Thank you.
We should have like a club of people that have status and don't want it all the time.
I mean, it's kind of a good problem for me to be having, so I'm not really complaining. It's just a layer on my world that was never there before, you know, and it's just kind of developed in the last couple of years, and I'm like, oh, what is this new thing? And I have to relate to this differently, and or do I have to? I don't have to. Like I think I feel like I have to, but I don't even really know that I do, and so I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just
It
there.
sounds like just learning how to deal with almost like a different identity in your relation to the world. Like all of a sudden people are relating to you in some way as a different person, and you're like, okay, from this different person, how do I hold my values?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
I saw a question from Brenda about, would you talk more about taking others' power away by interrupting them? One of the ways power shows up is just by who's speaking. So if somebody is speaking and you interrupt them, in that moment, you've taken the talking space, like you've taken the attention of the group. Sometimes if you interrupt them and the person who has power is actually very trusted, you lose status by doing so, because there's something going on that people were actually into, and you're like the bad person that's just like derailed things. But sometimes if what you're saying is something that if you say something that the leader has missed, like if you're like, actually, I think you missed this key point, then oftentimes you're taking some power, because you've just said like, okay, this person missed something important and I caught it. And there's in quite distinct from power. I don't know if this is fully related to power, but groups and people get very uncomfortable often when an interruption happens. Like as a leader, I have to be super cautious about interrupting somebody, because it's almost an instant shutdown for most people. They're like, oh, did I say something wrong? There's something that happens in our systems when we get interrupted. And it's almost like, even if I haven't taken power away from them externally, I've often taken away from them internally. Like they will get a little bit smaller. And so I try to use interruption as a last resort because of that. When people interrupt me, can you say, I'm not sure I totally understand the question, taking others' power away when they interrupt you? Oh, how do we with when others interrupt us? Okay. Yes. So if somebody interrupts you, a good way to then kind of regain where you were at is to include what they said. Just literally be like, that was, I'm super grateful you said that. And like hearing that, you know, or say somebody interrupts me right now and says like, hey, Sarah, we're at the top of the hour, we need to go. I could take that as like, oh shoot, like I wasn't watching the time, and like give up control and just say, we're ending the call now, which is kind of actually a surrender of power. It's not taking my agency to wrap things up nicely. But what I could say instead is, wow, that's totally right. We are at the top of the hour, and hearing that, I'd love to close things. So I'm actually making the objection my own by including it. And I love it these days when people contradict or interrupt me, because they're giving me free information. And if I can include it, I actually get the trust of the group more. When you lose trust in a group or in a situation is when you resist and react to the other person. Because most of the time people aren't interrupting in order to undercut you. They're interrupting because there's something in them is getting hit. Like there's a value of theirs that they're trying to protect. There's actually something that's important that they're seeing, and maybe you don't see it, but they're a bellwether for others. Like other people in the group maybe do. So rather than coming from your own set of values and being like, that's not accurate, you can include what they said and, you know, use it as information. Awesome. So thank you all so much for coming on this call. This was really delightful, and I'm really curious about what all of you took away from it. So feel free to email me if you'd like. I'll put my email in chat, and I hope you all have a really wonderful day. Thanks for coming on. I'll post the recording as well of this call.
Bye. Thank you. It was really quiet. So
Bye.
thank you. Bye.
Bye. Good to see you.
Bye.
You.